John, one thing that I'd like to make clear is not just the timeline about the events we're going to talk about today, but kind of a glossary, kind of a definition of the education system, retirement benefits, and how the whole thing works, just to give viewers an idea of, say, as you're starting out as a teacher, what benefits go into the system, when can it be enhanced, what can they do to make their payout bigger? How does it work?
Big picture, Steve, is that the state teachers retirement system, which is there are two, the public employees non-teaching system and the state teachers retirement system. They're similar, but one basic ingredient is your base salary goes into and is reported to STRS, and they're an outside agent, state teachers retirement system.
Okay.
So a certain percentage of your salary is taken from your check and matched or a similar percentage from the district's coffers. That goes to an account for you individually, and that salary ultimately, with your years of service, and if you have 30 years, your highest year of compensation, in some cases it's the highest 3 years, is then calculated to determine your monthly allowance in retirement.
Okay. And those 3 years, does it matter whether it's in the beginning, middle, or the end of my career?
If that is the method used, it's the highest 3 years of your career. So
okay.
It doesn't really matter whether it was the last 3 years.
Okay.
But if you have 30 plus years, you get your highest year.
Okay. Is there any special circumstance regarding the last 2 or 3 or few years of your career, or not? Does it not matter?
I mean, there could be. There are other factors that STRS considers. Is this a compensation that was added to inflate your retirement income?
Okay.
There are stories of people converting all of their health and welfare benefit value onto the salary schedule. And
is that allowed?
That is considered spiking. That is a classic definition of spiking, and if STRS audits and finds it, they will disallow the income into the calculation, and if you've been overpaid, they will go after the overpayment and take it out of your check.
Coming back to you for that money.
Yes.
So just to be clear, when we say spiking, we're talking about a deliberate attempt to increase your pension payout after once your career is over. Is that accurate
or
enough?
just before your career is over.
Okay.
So
okay.
They can look back, I think 7 years into your compensation is typical. Today, they could, even if you're retired, they could go back 7 years and see what happened with your income calculation.
Okay. So there are acceptable ways of increasing approved ways of increasing one's pension. Then there are certain things that are not approved, that are not acceptable. Certainly, if not illegal, they're not acceptable, that we're going to talk about today, that may have happened.
That's correct.
Okay. So let's go back in time. Thank you for the definitions. We're going to go back in time to 2006. Ex-Superintendent Jeffrey Hubbard has a new contract. It's signed, sealed, and delivered.
Yes.
And now we're fast-forwarding 2 years to July 2008, and his contract is up for renewal. And the board determines that they want to throw a few more things at him, for lack of a better description, in order to make sure that he's happy and that he stays with the district, because in their opinion he's doing a good enough job to deserve these things. Is that accurate so far?
In general, yes.
Okay. One of the things that they did, according to the records that you have secured under a personal request, California Public Records Act request, is authorization to purchase something called a life insurance annuity in the amount of $20,000.
That's correct.
Okay, and that was meant as
I believe it was 7.8, the 7.8 addendum. So it was starting in July of 2007.
Okay, okay, very, very good. Thank you. So everything is fine, except we're not really sure what a life insurance annuity is. I looked and I could not find such a product, but for lack of a better term, we'll call it a life insurance policy. But then something out of the ordinary happens. Why don't you describe that with this $20,000 that they had set aside for this life insurance policy?
Well, when I look back on the records provided, which mostly came from the district, many people would think it would be a $20,000 life insurance policy, as you described, which would probably cost in today's market, $2.50. But in fact, as a life insurance annuity, it really is a $20,000 payout tax-free to the person, and it would appear to me, the way it was worded, that would be in each of the 3 years of the contract, because it was extended. So that's year 1, 2, and 3. So that was the issue there is it was not stated publicly on the agenda that there was a $20,000 tax-free.
So what? It wasn't on
payment.
the agenda. So what?
What was on the agenda is a 5.5% increase, just like all the other employees got through the cost of living adjustment. I think the public had a right to know. I think that's disturbing, and that has to do with a lot of the transparency issues that I've raised. That public ought to know that $20,000 is being increased in the superintendent's contract above anybody else's.
So two issues. So it's really $60,000 because we're talking about 3 additional years of his contract.
That's the way I read it.
Okay. And the fact that it was not on the agenda, is that, again, not using the term illegal, but is that out of the ordinary? Is that not an acceptable procedure for a school board to not include this?
Well, there have been some changes as a result of the city of Bell that make it probably illegal today. I don't know.
But at that time?
Totally inappropriate?
Yes.
Deceptive?
Yes.
I definitely.
Okay.
Would have raised the ire of the employees and the public, I believe.
Certainly not, we would not call this a very transparent
No, it's a backdoor way in the fine print that went under the public's radar.
Okay. And so, so this got wind of CalSTRS, got wind of STRS, a state retirement system.
Yes.
And why don't you walk us through that process then? How did they find out about this whole life insurance annuity product?
Well, in some cases, the STRS initiates an individual audit of an employee when they retire. That occurred with Hubbard. And upon their review, a public record that is generated from that audit is the final disposition. And what that shows is that that $20,000 was in fact converted to merit pay of 7.6%, which is the equivalent. And that occurred very close to his retirement date. So they disallowed that redistribution of money and said that it was designed to increase the retirement benefit.
Their exact wording is, this remuneration was paid for the principal purpose of enhancing your benefit.
That is HR lingo for spiking.
Okay.
Yeah, the common language way of saying that is spiking.
Sure, okay.
So they not only disallowed it as an increase that went into the calculation for his monthly retirement allowance, they also said, you've been retired for several months, you're going to have to pay back what we paid you.
The process of converting this life insurance annuity / policy to merit pay, how does that happen? Who has to be aware of it? Who has to approve it? Who has to recommend it to someone? How does that process start?
Well, I didn't have all of those records, but typically there is a salary statement each year. Now, I noticed that the salary statement for 7-8 didn't include a $20,000 tax-free annuity by any lingo. In a later year, I think it was 10-11, then, and I haven't seen that salary statement, but I believe it appeared as a merit pay provision in his salary statement that would then have been considered in the calculation for his retirement.
But it wasn't magic. Somebody had to say to someone, hey, let's convert this to...
That would have gone to the board for their approval.
I'm talking about the genesis now. Who would have first raised the issue, typically? I know we don't know in this case exactly, but who typically would have said, hey, I want to convert this product to merit pay?
Well, I'm not privy to the exact details. Even though I'm in HR, I wasn't in the seat I'm in, or a seat when I left. But even then, the business official, the top business official, has been involved in negotiating directly with the board in closed session with regard to the superintendent's contract. So
Okay.
I believe they would have been advised, they would have signed off on the salary statement and change of the compensation, and they would have called it a no increase because you're swapping and redistributing funds that were already allocated, even though it wasn't publicly
So it's
known.
zero effect on the budget, according in their
On the
in their
budget,
minds.
yes,
Right.
but would have increased the retirement
Pension,
compensation.
right? So
yes.
ultimately, taxpayers are paying additional for that. Okay,
Correct.
so this assistant superintendent would gather the information, present it to the board, and the board would then approve it or not accordingly.
Yes,
These-
deputy superintendent.
Deputy superintendent. These approvals that the board makes, are these individual, these salary enhancements, are they done in one vote, or are they done individually?
For top cabinet members, the superintendent may be done separately.
Okay,
They
so
may be done together, it depends.
okay, so that's quite possible that the deputy superintendent presents these items to the school board, and they are looking at this. This is not, I'm so used to seeing consent calendar items, just 7-0 votes, and they really, in my opinion, don't know exactly about the details of what they're voting on. But in this case, it could very well be that they were given the details of this process, that this life insurance product is being converted to merit pay, and they approved it. This doesn't just have to have the approval of the school board president, but the entire board.
That's correct.
Okay.
But
All right.
it could be fairly obscure on a consent agenda at that time. I think the law requires that it be done in open session as an action item at this time.
Okay. So then we've got a document approving this. It's signed by the then board president, Martha Fleur.
Yes,
So she certainly had knowledge of this.
approving the $20,000
Approving the $20,000
life
conversion.
insurance annuity.
Yeah, and approving the conversion to merit pay.
I believe so, but I'm not sure I ever saw that record.
Okay. But if she didn't, then certainly the entire board did.
I would imagine.
Okay. All right. So let's fast forward it to last year. And John Caldecott, and you're working in the district as the HR, I call you the HR guru. What happened?
Well, as the executive director of HR, I heard some conversation from the superintendent and the CBO, deputy superintendent, about changing the salary schedule structure for managed certificated management under SDRS. When I asked why we're doing that and what was the basis for that, I could not get an answer. And that I've already given out the quote from a top-level business administrator that, yeah, there's a problem, but if you pursue it, you're going to need a set of whistles and you're going to hurt all of your colleagues. And I thought that that's really inappropriate, and I reported it as such. That to suggest that I can ignore a public compensation issue because it might hurt my colleagues and I'm exempt from the law and as a district is ludicrous. And I believe the deputy or top administrator would need to know that. So I believe they did. So there was a problem. My goal was to find out what that problem was that I need a set of whistles for. This is one thing that came up in November of 2012 when Navarro was there that clearly STIRS said is not appropriate compensation under the education code. Well, that's significant. So anybody in like circumstance or similar circumstance could have that same problem. So what were those circumstances? This was one of them. I'm not convinced that was the only one. But I wanted to know before we went to change an entire salary structure, what it is that we're correcting and why we're doing it legally and make sure it's appropriate.
So the attempt to change the salary structure could have very well been based on the events we've been discussing about Jeff Hubbard.
One of the events, yes.
That's the, okay. And so then we move forward, and now we have the deputy superintendent speaking to you about your set of whistles, and the assumption is that he's not operating without the knowledge of the superintendent on this issue. Okay, so now we've got potentially two people, high level, two highest people in the district administration who may have been fully aware that they were trying to close the barn door, whatever analogy we want to use, metaphor, close the barn door after the horses got out, put the toothpaste back in the tube, etc. So that's when you were advised about your set of whistles, and that, if I'm not mistaken, that really kind of made you sit up and take notice and make you want to pursue the truth.
It led me to asking more questions, and I will say that there is a STRS exception for 1 year to consolidate pay without having some of the consequences. And I understand that. I was asking those questions to make sure I understood, and what was resented was the fact that I was not obedient, that I was asking. First of all, it was being proposed after we had closed negotiations. As the chief negotiator, I thought that was inappropriate. It lacks good faith, it's not transparent, and the timing is horrible. That was one issue I had. But I thought, as the HR person, I needed to have professionally an understanding of what was going on if I was going to be asked to explain it to others.
So now we have another level here. We're not only talking about something that may have been done financially inappropriate, but now on another level we have one top administrator, or perhaps two, trying to drive the behavior of HR person, head of HR, to keep silent about something that he has a qualified suspicion may be inappropriate financially.
Yes.
It was made in no uncertain terms to you that you need to stop researching this.
Yes, I was pressured, I was intimidated. There were countless cabinet meetings where I was put on the spot and attempted to make me proceed without this understanding. I was, at one point, I was told I lacked the intelligence to understand what the proposal was that the CBO was presenting. But that's just one example, and that came, yes, from those two administrators, the superintendent and the deputy superintendent. And it was abusive, and it was part of my report to the board as inappropriate conduct.
When you were told you lacked the intelligence, however that was termed, was that in a meeting with other people? Other people heard this?
Yes, it was.
Interesting. Okay, so you decided that you were going to go forward anyway, and you raised your hand up even higher, and you said, I think there's something wrong here.
Yes, I did. I reported that I had a complaint. That was one component of it, is the abuse and retaliation and pressure to do something that I believe, I had no reason to believe it was appropriate. And so I reported that, as well as other things like an administrator being paid inappropriately, and that compensation was misreported to STRS. It was reported as the type of income that goes into your retirement as an additional 20 work days, whereas I was told that it wasn't being reported that way. Well, I had the STRS record that confirmed my suspicions, so I was being told a lie.
Okay, so it was being reported to STRS the way you believed it was.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right, so you went through, it seems to me, from what I have read, you tried to go through the chain of command to do the right thing, to be heard, to bring this issue to the fore, because you suspected that something was inappropriate. And so now we're into
October of 2014. Yes, I tried countless ways to attempt to find solutions to this before I filed a complaint against the superintendent. And I do want to say these are two significant ones, but there was also an offer of pay to a colleague of Dr. Navarro's that was $30,000 above the standard district practice. He personally interceded. I reported that to the board. He overrode HR and stepped in and made that taking someone from bottom administrative pay to the very top. Reasons unknown.
That's irregular?
Very. I mean, it was $30,000 above the offer that would be typical under standard HR practice. That is handled by HR.
In the many years you've been doing this, had you ever seen anything like that before?
I've seen pay negotiated, but based on the specific parameters that we always used.
Right.
No, I had never seen the superintendent step in and make an offer directly to an employee, especially when it's a colleague. It gives a former colleague, it gives the appearance of impropriety,
yes,
special treatment, and expenditure of public funds that I have no explanation for. I immediately reported it to the board.
And when was
as
that?
part of the complaint.
When
it was during the complaint window. I had it started in October.
Right.
It came about somewhere, I believe, in early December.
Right. Okay.
And there were other parts of the complaint. Those are some significant ones.
Tell us about, so now we're into December, tell us about any reaction you received from the board regarding the complaint.
Before I do, I just want to say two others. I was also told and directed to increase the merit pay compensation for 2 administrators. And the rationale I was given by Navarro was that they were promised those pay increases by Hubbard. And I waited a meeting, but I came back and told Navarro in a cabinet meeting that I could not use that rationale. I knew he had heard about Hubbard's legal issues. His recommendation when he was superintendent way back was not going to be the basis that I could use publicly or otherwise to justify large merit pay increases for 2 people.
Well, if they were in fact promised by ex-Superintendent Hubbard, would there be any record of that? A written record of that?
I don't believe there could be, but not to my knowledge.
Okay, so if there's no written record, how would the current superintendent know that these were promised? Would he be taking the word of the employees?
Or others, I don't know exactly.
So if there's no written record, it's strictly what someone may have told him was promised to them.
Correct. That's correct. And we learned from the Hubbard case is that a superintendent cannot go to HR or payroll and say, I want to give an increase. That's a board action.
There's specific procedures.
Yes, the superintendent can't promise anything.
Right.
Until it's approved by the board, it is in process.
Interesting. So you were presenting this to the board, and your reaction back from the board regarding your complaint?
Well, at first I was told there would be an independent investigator with an impartial investigation.
Who told you that?
The district's representative, the board's representative at that time, Spencer Covert.
Okay.
And I...
Did he tell you that in writing?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Yes, it is part of the public records documents.
Mm-hmm.
Then it basically died. And I eventually had to ask the board what is going on. No one talked to me. No one talked to other individuals that were included in the complaint. And I was wondering what was going on. And then all of a sudden a decision was rendered by the board, and it said it has been prepared by the board, and it was to me and Dr. Navarro. And honestly, one of the major issues that jumps out as a red flag, given the types of allegations, in every process I've ever been in for the last 35 years in HR, an investigation is required. To come out with a report without investigating, make whatever findings you have irrelevant, invalid, faulty, flawed, and fatally flawed.
Could it be that there was an investigation but it didn't include you?
That is certainly possible.
But
no one
certainly
else
should have included you.
Well,
one would think.
That would be inappropriate in itself, but I don't believe that anyone was talked to that was mentioned in the complaint.
Okay.
But
yeah,
that is a normal. I mean, you tell
Sure.
when you commit to an independent investigator, that's something you need to follow through with as well.
One would think. You said that no one talked to me. By no one, you meant the board. No one on the board was talking to you about this?
Well, there was an initial conversation with Spencer Covert about an informal effort to try to resolve things with Navarro, and that dropped. And I wrote a letter saying that would not be sufficient. I wanted to proceed through the complaint process. Okay. Then it dropped.
Okay. And you say no one talked to me. That means that you didn't receive any
no
response at all?
No contact by an investigator. The next I heard, the board issued me findings without a discussion of the facts.
So no one reached out to you from the board and say, hey, don't worry, we're taking care of this, or I don't want to talk to you? Nothing. No communication whatsoever?
No.
Nothing.
One thing that is typical, now everybody's not a professional investigator, but talking to the complainant is a key.
A little unusual.
That is included. I've never conducted an investigation without talking to the complainant. And how would I know that? Well, in HR, all complaint procedures end in HR.
If this procedure, this investigation was performed, is there a written record of it somewhere?
There would be typically, yes.
Have you requested that? Do we know if it exists even?
I don't think anybody has suggested in my travels that there was an investigation. After the board wrote me the letter December 10th, on December 11th, I wrote them back saying, you didn't do an investigation, your findings are not valid. I gave all the attachments back to them that have been considered in my complaint. I told them this is a public record, that I was a whistleblower and had repeatedly asked for that protection, and that they failed by not conducting an investigation. Whatever conclusions they arrived at were flawed. I never received a response to that, except ultimately my termination a couple months later.
Mm-hmm. And regarding your termination, what was the exact reason for your termination? What was the stated reason for your termination?
The stated reason was I was released without cause from my contract, which was a 3-year contract, and I was paid the required 18 months to abolish that contract obligation, essentially. That was the official reason given.
Okay. And did they ask you to conduct an exit interview?
I had no contact with the superintendent that was being anticipated, that it was being recommended. I was not asked to speak, given the opportunity to speak at the closed session where they made that determination, which is also typical.
So you don't know whether you were fired because you were incompetent, because they didn't like your tie, or you have no...
I know exactly, Steve, why I was fired.
And that is?
And the records show that from the first public information request to the documents up to the day of my notice from the superintendent. And all I can say is I had other retaliation complaints that went to the board that were not investigated nor responded to. On that day, let's just finish this part with this day I was sent a text by the superintendent. Prior to that evening, I come in the morning, there's a letter from the superintendent regarding a 3-page, I would say, rant, and things he wanted me to do that next week. And I wrote a letter to the board about retaliation, ongoing. That morning, it went out about 7:30 a.m. That evening, the writ of mandate that I requested because they had denied access to records hit the court. Those are the two things that happened that was 3 o'clock on the writ. By 6 o'clock, I received a text to, John, you need to check your email because I'm recommending your dismissal. I then found out that on the 27th, that coming Tuesday, he was going to recommend to the board that I be dismissed without cause. So at least his letter to me that morning that I picked up thought I was going to be there next Wednesday. Basically talks about things that I'm supposed to do. Yeah. So something happened that day, and the only two things, my retaliation notice to the board and the writ. Neither one of those should be the basis for a without cause dismissal or any dismissal. No one can be dismissed for retaliation of whistleblower or First Amendment rights. No one. Even a without cause dismissal. That would be tantamount to saying, well, you're a substitute, you don't have a contract, but you made a report about the district's wrongdoing, so we're gonna fire you and not hire you anymore. Well, yeah, we have the right not to hire you, but not for that reason.
And your termination had to have been approved by the board.
Yes,
and it was approved 7-0.
Yes.
Without any investigation to your complaints, and maybe we shouldn't assume that they were told in a closed session, the superintendent would have told the board specifically why he wants you terminated? Or does he not have to? How does that work?
I would assume that this board, after watching them for 10 years, would say, what is the justification for this? Did we investigate the retaliation complaints? Has the superintendent acted appropriately? Is there any merit to anything John is saying? because a whistleblower just needs to make a good faith report.
Right.
I don't have to prove anything beyond that, and sometimes I can't because they won't give me the information. So a reasonable employer, which is the board by definition, would have pursued questions regarding why are we doing this?
If for no other reason than perhaps for legal protection as well, one would think.
Is this legal?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would want to ask, because whistleblower laws have both criminal and civil aspects to them.
This is all conjecture, theory, supposition. The next question I want to ask you, but what is it in this school board that would make them not want to question you at all? Not only forget the not conducting this investigation, but not wanting to hear your side of the story. What do you think is behind that?
Well, they seem to give their unconditional support to the administrator in charge, which would be the superintendent. I also am concerned that the records received from STIRS that show some really backdoor dealings with compensation don't reflect well on the board. A board should say, no, we have an obligation to the public. You need to put that up front on the agenda because that is inaccurate. So they would not engage in those things. I would say any reasonable person, board member or not, given my history with them and with the district, they would have asked more questions. They would have personally involved an investigation and findings that were independent of the superintendent. Now, I think where it went wrong is the superintendent, who was the perpetrator in these issues, was directly involved in guiding district attorneys and recommending to the board. Well, that is completely inappropriate. You need to, when you're the subject of a complaint, you step back and say, I can't handle this. Right. That's common, and I have certainly done that myself, and I've seen superintendents do it. He remained personally involved in everything and continued to retaliate and intimidate, and he really didn't talk to me after I filed my first complaint in October, unless he had to.
What happens now? You got some records from your personal CPRA request. There's an appeal process now on the original one. Walk us through that. What happens now?
Well, I do have a commitment now to the public because John could just walk away. My contract's ended. I've been paid out. I'm retired, and I have no issue with that. The issues I have are about transparency by the board. The Public Record Act should apply to everyone, including John. I think that the public should see the issues, but also see that there's no investigation. See how John was treated. Now, what's going backdoor around the district is, wait a minute, how could Caldecott be fired? He's been here 10 years. He has an impeccable reputation. And Navarro just said, go away and we'll pay you 18 months.
And it was approved by 7 people.
Approved by 7 people? Absolutely. I mean, I'd hold the board more accountable than Navarro. Because even if
ultimately,
he was
their
personally
decision.
Involved, yeah, they could have said, no, wait a minute, we need to check some things out.
Time out.
So that, I'm also very concerned about the culture in the district, that it is, obedience is now, should be on the front door to the district office. Are you going to be obedient? If you're not going to be obedient, you could be terminated, your career could be ended, subtle things could happen to you that will deviate your career, and these things are happening. This is who Fred Navarro is, and the board is letting it happen. Now, the culture of the district before, granted, not perfect, but it was about risk-taking for everyone in the district. And people felt comfortable trying things and taking risks, and relying on the fact that someone wouldn't come down on someone because they asked questions.
Right.
It's like, Steve, why do you want to do it that way? What about this? What about that? That was welcomed. Now it is, what does Fred want? And that is the culture. It is unhealthy and toxic. And I have an obligation, I think, to pursue protecting future whistleblowers that could be subjected to wrongdoing and very inappropriate behavior.
Does that obedience include as well a fear of speaking up, of saying anything? It's one thing to do what someone asks you to do just because you're obedient. Does it also include the flip side, which is I'm not going to say anything. Even if I see something wrong, I'm not going to say anything.
To a degree that I have never, ever seen.
Okay.
And people can't say it publicly because that in and of itself, I disagree with Fred Navarro. That cannot be stated in any context, in any meeting, behind closed doors. In fact, people have been told not to talk to me, not to discuss my issues. And that, is, and I think am a poster child for what Fred can do to someone who asks questions. There is nothing that I did or said or asked that wasn't completely mainstream HR work.
Right. Transparent.
And yet the consequences are obvious.
Yeah. Okay. So now, what next steps for John Caldecott? Where are you at? Where are we going?
I'm going to pursue the appeal. I've already heard from the court, and they seem to be acting quickly. They've asked the district for a written response within 15 days. We're probably 5 days away from that timeline. I think the trial court erred in saying that we don't need to give the records to Caldecott because he already has them. There are appellate court cases that say it doesn't matter why the person's requesting them, and it doesn't matter what they're going to do with them. They have a right to be considered whether are they public records or aren't they.
What are the possible potential district responses to the appeal now? What is the shopping list of things they could say or do?
They will obviously, I think, continue their pattern of trying to obscure records from the public. What does the superintendent have to hide? What do the elected board members have to hide when they are in a role of having direct control over all district resources? I think the public has a right to know what goes on behind closed doors. And you're going to get a good picture of it if you're a patient reader. But at the end of the day, you're going to say, how could you not investigate these things? How could you not have an independent investigator give you board members factual information that you can consider? That is the real travesty. People will get lost in the HR details of the significant allegations, but that's really what happened. They're concealing it.
So you're expecting their response is going to be consistent with the other responses, which is we're not going to give up anything and just cite the same
all records are excluded from the Public Records Act. That has been their position all along.
Okay. And so if they say that in their response, then we have a judge who is determining whether that's appropriate or which one is appropriate on its merits, and we'll proceed, and we'll either get the records released or we won't accordingly.
Through the Public Records Act.
Yes.
Obviously, I still have the option. I have all the records. I know what they say.
Yes.
I can release them on my own. But just like I chose to go through the STIRS Public Record Request Act, I felt that was the most appropriate way, especially since the district was threatening me that Navarro somehow has privacy rights as a high-level, top-level public official. In this process, they're defending his rights to privacy, because I have waived mine specifically in writing to the board.
In order to get the truth told.
Yeah, and usually it's the employee, not the supervisor, that is claiming privacy. So I find the whole thing to be highly irregular.